Picking up right where I left off, this is going to be the 1920s Mass Culture Part 3. We're going to finish up recorded music and probably, if I can get there in time, move on into commercial radio broadcasting, which is going to be huge. Okay, we've established that by the early 20th century, it's possible to record sound. Edison's cylinder thing was the cylinders. It was an early development. It was never commercially developed. Uh, they were good for maybe about 10 playbacks before they degraded beyond usefulness. Okay, you move on into the 20th century and we start to see phonograph records. They're made of some kind of what looks kind of like heavy plastic. I kind of know what they mean, what they are. They were played back on machines that were mechanical. Most popular being something called a Victrola. The ones in what I posted this week on the Canvas site were just little boxes with a big horn for a amplifier because they're not electric. But the Victrola plus a bunch of copycats, they're all called Victrolas, right? So to play a record, you wind the thing up and put your record on the turntable and make sure you have a stylus. I don't know what they call it. Look like a pencil lead. I know this because I have one. My wife was one of her many uncles' favorite niece, and her grandparents had one of those from the 20s or teens or whatever. And he got it when they divided all the stuff up. He drops by our house and drops it off, sitting in my entry hall. We don't use it because it's mostly busted. Records are all still in there. Then you put the stylus on the record and flip the button, and it spins at 78 revolutions per minute and plays back a scratchy version of music, which is mainly just a slicker version of the kind of music people made for themselves. Now, the profit generator for popular music was the sale of sheet music through the 19th century into the 20th, and in the absence of any kind of electronic entertainment, every middle-class family had a piano and one or two people could play it, and the supper dishes have been dried and put up. You gather around the piano and somebody sits down at the keyboard and plays the latest song. Everybody sings along. If you're not comparing that to anything, I guess that was fun for those days, for those people. Okay, so the first recorded music is kind of the same songs people were used to. It's just kind of on the way to become a cultural phenomenon. I read somewhere that Americans purchased something like 75 million phonograph records in the year 1919. The 1920s, that continues and begins to merge with the popular music styles. That's mainly urban. Country people, it's just country type music that they'd always had. But if you live in a city, you have access to cutting edge styles. Around the turn of the century, it was jazz. No, pardon me, back that up. It's called ragtime. Ragtime was kind of a light-hearted, syncopated piano music. Originated mainly by black musicians, and it's very, very popular. And today, there are people that play it, and they play it way faster than it's supposed to. You probably haven't seen a 1973 movie called The Sting. Find that and see that. That hadn't aged today. Okay, it's every American's duty to watch The Sting, and it's why we call certain police operations sting operations. But they use a lot of this jazz, this ragtime type music. Some people were deeply offended by ragtime. Why? Because after the Civil War, which had been such a huge tragedy, the worst one we've ever had, enormous death toll, the popular music reflected that. It's sad and it's slow and it's weepy and upbeat music. Just that bothered people. And there was a song written in 1912 by Irving Berlin when he was quite young called Alexander's Ragtime Band. There were city councils across the land banning the playing of Alexander's Ragtime Band. Why? Because at certain intervals he would make fun of the old Stephen Foster songs. In any event, in the 1920s, ragtime yielded its dominance of popular music to jazz. This is very uh, improvisational um, band music. It's going to have, piano, bass, and brass instruments, trumpets, trombones, saxophones, that sort of thing. And you have your chord sequence and your basic melody line, and from there it's just a free for all. So as African Americans began abandoning the old South and moving into the northern cities, black musicians, particularly from New Orleans, carried this style with them. Okay, and it became so popular, breaking down all racial barriers, not necessarily all cultural ones, that the 1920s is sometimes called the Jazz Age. And I posted a video about that. I'm not sure whether it's in the November 2nd or November 9th. I've already set up some of the stuff for November 9th because it wouldn't all. The November 2nd list was just too long. Seriously, we get to this stuff, and the amount of just video, one click away stuff I can post to enrich the course and make it a broader and deeper experience is just mind boggling. I'm glad I can do that. Okay. Um, there were popular jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong who continued to be active as late as the 1960s. But there are jazz bands that toured the country, and they played in certain very fashionable night spots in Chicago and New York City and all around, and attracted upscale, liberated white audiences. There was something called the Cotton Club, I think, in New York City, which was probably the mecca of jazz music. Now, we're talking here about the recording industry. Of course, these jazz bands would travel around the country and play in venues like ballrooms, dance halls, such as that, and they'd sell some records on the side. Their main income comes from performance. Okay, not not really concert performance, just playing at dance halls. Now, by the late 1920s, we see the first recording artists. This will grow into what we've had for a long time now, where very popular music performers, their main income comes from the recording and sale of recorded music, and they do concerts on the side. So perhaps the first recording artist was actually one of the first country music artists. His name was Jimmy Rogers, spelled a little different, Gimmierrodgers. He was a railroad employee. Railroads employed vast numbers of people in those days. And sadly, Jimmy Rogers came down with tuberculosis, a lung disease. He couldn't work anymore. So to keep from starving, he got some of his buddies together and they started singing country music, a lot of it composed by Rogers himself. Now, we're not talking about the stuff you would hear on a country FM radio station today. We're talking about the real deal, the root stock, the old time hardcore country music. Wouldn't sound a whole lot alike. And he did that in 1927. Tuberculosis claimed his life 5 years later in 1932. And he had recorded quite a bit of music and probably too sick to go around doing performances. Maybe that may make him the first recording artist. If you're curious, there was a movie made. Seems hard for me to realize they're college students who were born around the time this movie came out. Seems contemporary to me. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? Very weird movie set in the mid 1930s, and it involves a lot of the music of that time, cultural icons, all stuff like that. It actually is supposed to be Homer's Odyssey set in Mississippi in the late 1930s. Try that. But there's a number of Jimmy Rogers songs in there. One that comes to mind, he's in the jailhouse now, and two or three others. The main one, Man of Constant Sorrow, was written for that movie. Um, and you're going to believe that's George Clooney singing it, but it's not. He's good at lip syncing. Okay, recorded music. Okay, the third technology was radio. Where'd that come from? The radio was invented by an Italian named Guglielmo Marconi in 1900. So, 75 years earlier, just sending a message could go faster than a messenger would be unthinkable. Then we get the telegraph in 1844, the telephone in 1876. See, the telegraph could just send coded messages, telephone could send voice messages, radio could send coded messages, not voices yet, without the wires. All right. They referred to it for quite a while as the wireless. Who uses it? Well, primarily ships at sea. As by the time of World War I or thereabouts, I believe by that time you could send and receive voices. And radio as a technology was the province, maybe law enforcement, military ships at sea, and hobbyists who would much later be called ham radio operators. I think that's probably gone now because technology's outdated. But these would be people who, the higher end ones, could both send and receive messages. Most of them are just listening in. You could clip out a coupon from the back of a magazine and send that in $2.50 someplace, and it would send you back what was called a crystal radio set. Okay. This is a science project kind of thing. You put it together, doesn't have a speaker, you probably have to have headphones, and you just tune around on it and try to eavesdrop on any conversations you might find. Now, executives at Westinghouse Corporation in Pittsburgh realized they could sell a lot of radios. Technology was much better by then. It was 1920. If there were anything out there to listen to, why would somebody, have to pay out by the month of radio when you're just looking for conversations to eavesdrop on? So this is one of those conundrums. You got like which came first, the chicken or the egg? You got the chicken waiting for the egg, waiting for the chicken, waiting for the egg. You won't be able to sell a lot of radios unless there's regular broadcasting with programming. You're not going to have radio stations with programming unless there are people out there to listen to it. So Westinghouse decided to place a bet, and in November 1920 they put the first commercially licensed radio station on the air in the United States, if not the world. Station KDKA is still on the air. It's been a TV station for quite a while now. First thing they broadcast were the election returns from 100 years ago. I just thought of that. The election of 1920, Warren G. Harding versus James Cox. Harding won. And I heard a recreation of that one time where his voice sounds kind of like they do now, updating the numbers around and interrupting himself periodically to say, if there's anybody out there hearing this, please send a postcard to the following address. They got no idea if anybody's even listening. They were. Now, from a ground zero start in November 1920, by the end of 1924, only 4 years later, there are over 500 radio stations in the United States, and the number is growing rapidly, and radios, or radio sets as they would have called them at the time, were just selling like hotcakes. The earliest ones looked like pieces of furniture. In fact, they looked like Victrolas, the stand-up box type. Has to be plugged in. You're not going to listen to one of those things without electricity, but it quickly became a regular form of entertainment. You have supper, wash and dry the dishes, put them up, settle into your easy chair, and listen to the radio. At first, all the programming is local, and in fact, the earliest radio stations were low wattage and short range. Like if you'd had a radio in your car, the signal would have faded out about the city limits or a little beyond. Sometimes merchants would get a license and buy the equipment and hire a sound engineer and somebody to talk on the radio, whatever, clear out some space in the stock room on the second floor of their store, attach a broadcast antenna to the wall outside, and go on the air. And that station had one job, that is, pull in enough listeners to listen to the advertising for that business. Around the mid-1920s, with stronger transmitters, radio stations became freestanding businesses that sold airtime to advertisers.